Welcome to Getting In, a College Coach podcast. I'm Sally Ganga, your host today. I'm really excited about, well, all our segments, but the last two segments, I will be talking with multiple colleagues who are sending or have sent students to college. You'll hear from them directly that just because they are professionals doesn't mean the process was easy for them. That said, they have some great advice and perspective for you parents. But first, I'm welcoming Jess Mosley, College Coach Finance expert, about preparing to complete the CSS profile, a financial aid document. Welcome, Jess.
Thanks, Sally.
All right. So a lot of people don't know what the CSS profile is because it's not actually like used by that many colleges. So
hmm
let's start with what is the CSS profile?
Sure. So the CSS profile is a supplemental financial aid application. Most families have heard of the FAFSA, which is the free application for federal student aid, but the CSS profile is put out by the College Board, who also puts out AP courses and they put out the SAT test. With that profile, what it does is essentially allows schools to provide more information in order for the schools to determine what kind of non-federal aid they're going to receive from the institution itself.
It was pretty handy when the FAFSA was having all those troubles now too, wasn't it?
Oh, yes. Yeah. So the schools that were using the CSS profile actually did have a lot more success in getting out their financial aid packages on time rather than the schools that just use the FAFSA.
Yeah, things were pretty stressful for them and the families, of course. So
Right.
So I think we've just identified one reason why a school might require
hmm
it. But what are other reasons why a school might require it in addition
Sure.
to the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid?
So the CSS profile gathers a lot more detailed information than the FAFSA actually does. They can allow the schools to ask customized questions. They can also use it for international populations. So that's a big reason some schools use it. Even if they don't use it for domestic students,
Mhm.
they may use it for international families. It also allows schools to let families explain special circumstances up front, whereas the FAFSA does not. So it can give you an opportunity to say right away, hey, our income was different, or something along those lines. And then it also allows for divorced or separated parents to have information coming from both households.
Mhm. Okay. And so which schools require it and how can families identify them?
Sure. So about 200 institutions require the CSS profile. That is usually more selective schools, typically private schools. And you can identify those schools just by going to the school's website. So that's really the best way to identify which schools are going to look at the CSS profile. You would want to go to that school's financial aid checklist or the financial aid page that's associated with the admissions page to see the exact checklist for students who are coming in first time or as transfer students. Um, and then also with that, it's going to be schools that typically have a larger endowment is usually kind of the schools that are looking at that because they have more money to give out.
Mhm.
And then finally, because of the issues with the FAFSA, even though it's usually about 200 schools, we're seeing that number grow and different kinds of schools use the CSS profile because they know that they could get out their financial aid packages sooner. So one example we have of that for sure right now is the University of Vermont. They have just decided that they're going to use the CSS profile for incoming families.
Yeah, because the deadline, I mean, you can submit the CSS profile in October, right?
Yeah, that's another thing right now is that's because the FAFSA has been delayed until December, the
Mhm.
CSS profile comes out October 1st. And so the
Mhm.
schools can get it in a more timely manner and have the information they need to make decisions, especially for that early decision population.
What are some other differences between the FAFSA and the CSS profile?
Sure. So I think some of the bigger ones are what kind of information is gathered. On the FAFSA, they're really only looking at taxable income and information, whereas on the CSS profile, they're going to ask about untaxed information as well, including things like your contributions to retirement for a specific year. So things like 401k, 403b accounts, as well as like account contributions or HSA contributions as well. So the kind of information they're gathering from income and then also from assets. So on the FAFSA, they're really only looking at non-retirement assets, and they don't want you to report your primary home equity that you have. Whereas on the CSS profile, both of those things are gathered and could potentially be looked at. Now, we don't know of any school that's looking at retirement values, but they do ask about the information and what you have in your retirement accounts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so what should people have ready to complete the profile?
Sure. So it's additional documentation that you're going to need is going to be the 2023 tax year is what they're going to be looking at for students who are completing it for this upcoming 2025-26 cycle. So that's true for the FAFSA and the CSS profile. The FAFSA, however, pulls it directly from the IRS, whereas the CSS profile, you're going to have to enter everything manually. So you want to have your full return with you, as well as your W-2s, because there's information they're going to ask for from your W-2s. And you'll probably want to have future tax information or income information as well if it's available to you. So, especially if you had changes to your 2024 income, and they even asked about expected income in 2025. So that's definitely what you would want to have with you, including any, special circumstances documentation that you might want to talk about or upload if that's required. So some schools will also ask you to upload the tax documentation or other types of documentation to their secure portal called iDoc that they would request after the fact of completing the CSS profile.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So a lot
Mhm.
more details, it sounds like, a lot more to
Yep.
do. Okay.
hmm
All right.
Yeah, it takes a little bit more time, I would say, for sure, compared to the FAFSA, especially with the FAFSA as it's been boiled down now, since it's been simplified, as they would say. So there's a lot more questions. It will take you more time, certainly, than completing the FAFSA.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And when and where, do families complete the application?
Sure. So you can do the application at cssprofile.org. So that's CSSPROFILE.org. And it's available October 1st for the 25-26 academic year. So anybody who's a senior this year wants to complete the 2025-26 application. Um, and I would check the schools individually on their websites for the deadline. Usually their deadline aligns with what their admission deadline is, but you want to make sure that you have which deadline it is for that school specifically that you should be submitting it by.
Yeah, I talk to a lot of families who say, well, we can do the admissions first, right? And then worry about financial aid. And I'm
Yeah,
like, please don't do that
right.
because
Mhm.
you may end up getting nothing at all in that
Yeah. Yeah,
circumstance.
it's definitely, I do the same thing. I say, it's important to go ahead and add to your admissions checklist everything that you need to do for financial aid and when it's due by. It's a
Hmm.
really important step to make sure that when you find out you've been admitted, that you also know what you're going to get for financial aid soon thereafter.
Hmm. Hmm.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Now, I mean, is the CSS profile good for families, bad for families? I'm just kind of curious. It seems
Sure.
like because it's more information, in some cases it might help a family, in other cases
hmm
it might not, right?
Yeah, I think it can go both ways. Ultimately, when I worked at schools that use the CSS profile, you can really help to correct mistakes that families make that go either way. So it could be mistakes they made that would help them, but also mistakes they made that would hurt them. And so being able to look at that information, compare it against the FAFSA, and then often have the documentation to back it up. It can really help. And I think a lot of schools that do have this huge amounts of money to give out, they do tend to be a little more generous often than the FAFSA.
Yeah, schools like the Ivies. When I
Yeah.
worked at the University of Chicago, we were quite
hmm
generous, which was something that
Right.
I loved, like being
Yes.
able to know if a student was high need, we would be able to really meet that need and
hmm
often exceed families' expectations even. So, um,
Exactly.
all right.
Yeah.
Well, great.
Great.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Of course, no problem. Thanks, Sally.
Okay. Bye-bye now.
Bye.